Welcome to another edition of Retracing History. We're back in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, although it probably doesn't look like it. This is probably a part of Gettysburg that you've not seen before, or at the very least when you read about the battle, you have not heard about. Nothing's looking familiar here. Well, we are standing along, aptly named Long Avenue here in Gettysburg, and I've come to visit a historic cemetery. No, not the National Cemetery, which is located a few blocks over that direction where 3,000 soldiers of the Union Army are buried. No, that's not where we're visiting. Rather, we're visiting Lincoln Cemetery, or some call it Goodwill Cemetery. It is here where approximately 30 United States colored troops are interred. Most of them local residents they recruited for the USCT during the American Civil War. And this is also one of the older cemeteries that survive in the borough. Let's check it out. The origins of this cemetery go back to 1866, right after the American Civil War, when key figures of Gettysburg's black community got together and formed the Sons of Goodwill. The intention of the Sons of Goodwill was to establish a proper burial lot for the United States colored troops, veterans of segregated regiments that served for the Union Army in the American Civil War, as well as, keep in mind for future generations, a common burial lot where they could be interred. Now, there were several key names involved, but the one that you'll probably recognize if you delve deep into Gettysburg lore is Basil Biggs. We have talked about Basil Biggs on this channel before. Basil Biggs was a noted veterinarian here in Gettysburg, but he did a variety of different occupations. He would use his wagon for a variety of different transportations, which included the movement of corpses from burials on the battlefield to the National Cemetery in 1863 and 1864. Another interesting story with that wagon, he would often offer rides to people of Gettysburg's African American community to the polling booth, as many of them did not have the means of travel to get into downtown to go to the ballot boxes. So Biggs was one of the more prominent names that were part of the Sons of Goodwill and helped to establish a cemetery behind here. Initially, they would buy a half-acre plot in April of 1867. That plot is on the opposite end where you see a lot of the headstones built up. And over the years, you could tell it grew from its initial half-acre. In 1906, a nearby church, they were looking to relocate their cemetery on York Street, and they actually petitioned the Adams County and were granted permission to exhume the bodies and purchase an adjacent lot to what the Sons of Goodwill owned and expanded the cemetery. And throughout the early 20th century, an entity known as the Lincoln Lodge, which was a group of African Americans that were involved with the Elk Lodge here in Gettysburg, they oversaw the preservation of this entire lot. That wasn't until that society, I can't find if they officially disbanded. I think it was more they gradually died off and nobody kept going. And if you're wondering why you have the name Lincoln Cemetery, not Sons of Goodwill anymore, it's from this Lincoln Lodge. So for many years, this cemetery, which has over 400 burials, was largely overlooked, unkept by the borough of Gettysburg. And it's only been in the past 20 years with the founding of the Lincoln Cemetery Preservation Association that you're going to start seeing the existing headstones be cleaned up, and you're going to see investigative work to locate the unmarked burials. Now, the Lincoln Cemetery actually made some headlines this October of 2023. The Preservation Association implemented ground-penetrating radar to mark the known graves to confirm, yes, there's somebody actually buried under those headstones, but also to find how many unmarked graves. And they found well over 100 unmarked graves. That's at least from their first run over. There could be more that just are not popping up on ground-penetrating radar. So if you see all these orange flags, those are graves. They're next to the marked graves, as well as you can see here much closer, the unmarked graves. So the Project Association, they have this box set up next to the cemetery, and they're not open today, but what they do have is this nice little pamphlet which provides information on the USCT troops that are buried in this property. And if you see the monument on the pamphlet here, well, it's right next to the rostrum over here. Now, the cemetery is generally closed to the public. There are certain days throughout the year where volunteers of the Preservation Association will come out down and give tours, as well as when they're going through and tidying up the property. Oddly enough, can you believe it's actually January? It's over 60 degrees. It's over after 5 o'clock on a late January day. Very breezy out, but very warm. So January, obviously, there ain't gonna be an open house for the cemetery. In either case, though, what we're gonna do is I'm gonna try to get some photographs of some graves, and I have actually brought some notes with me about graves that are along the rail line. So we're just gonna highlight just a few of the graves and a few of the interesting stories preserved within Lincoln Cemetery. So apologies about the shakiness, but I want to make sure you can see the name on that headstone. That's the grave of Lewis Spriggs. He was born in 1845 in Shenandoah County, Virginia, but eventually found his way here in Adams County, Pennsylvania. He enlisted in Company B of the 32 United States Color Troops just a few miles west of here in Fairfield, Pennsylvania. Now, the 32nd USCT, they were attached to the Department of the South, and essentially this force were intended to raid the coast of South Carolina and Georgia around Charleston and Savannah. And Spriggs would see action as his regiment took part in the Battle of Honey Hill. It was fought November 30th, 1864. And this was an effort, a preemptive effort by Union forces to cut off the rail lines between Savannah and Charleston before William Tecumseh Sherman's Union Army could reach Savannah overland. However, the Department of the South were unsuccessful in their attack at Honey Hill and were driven back. And one of the casualties in that fight, well, was actually Lewis Spriggs. He was wounded in that fight. He would later be discharged the following year. And he returned here to Adams County, only lived a few more years in 1868. And here we have in row 9, grave number 19, Joseph Turner. He was born in 1834 in Stafford County, Virginia, and he found his way in Pennsylvania in time for the American Civil War. He actually ended up being recruited with Company D of the 25th United States Color Troops, and he enlisted in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, about a half-hour west of Gettysburg. And he would be attached to the Department of the Gulf, and their jurisdiction was essentially the Gulf of Mexico and the lower half of the Mississippi River Valley. Now, after his service in the American Civil War, he returned to this region, and he lived for many years west of town with a Major Culbertson. When Culbertson passed away, Turner moved into the almshouse, and we visit the location of the almshouse for Adams County. It's just north of Gettysburg, and it was the site of the Barlow's Knoll action on July 1st, 1863. If you're not familiar with the term almshouse, we would essentially call today the poorhouse. And Turner was an interesting figure. He would frequently speak in biblical expressions, and he was an avid reader of the Bible. And many townspeople recalled in the late 19th century how Turner was always eager to read to his employers, to his friends, to even strangers on the streets. By all accounts, was a very nice individual who had found a connection with a higher power. And he would continue these readings from Scripture even when he was in the almshouse. Unfortunately, since the almshouse was not very well maintained, he ended up contracting frostbite in at least one, if not both, of his feet, and this required amputation. Complications from the amputation would lead to Turner's death in 1899. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to get a frontal view of the headstone we're talking about. I don't want to trespass, but we are looking at the headstone of Owen Robinson, and that would be the third headstone down on the left, the very tall one. Well, Robinson, he was a storyteller, the only way I can describe it. So he was born as an enslavement in Baltimore, Maryland. Now, there is dispute over what year he was born. Historians say that he was born around 1805, but don't tell Robinson that. Robinson claimed to have been born in 1790 and vividly remembered the person that owned him and said that he had the devil in him, right up until he found God and then had a change of heart and decided at his death he would emancipate all of his slaves. And that included Mr. Robinson here. Well, per Mr. Robinson's story, after he was freed, he worked as a shipmate for several years in the Chesapeake Bay before he found his way up here in Gettysburg in the 1840s. And he opened a quite popular oystery saloon as well as an ice cream parlor. Now, I couldn't find out how long that saloon and parlor ran. I don't know if it was in operation during the battle, but Robinson was a longtime resident in the area, so I would have a confidence that he was in the area when the big battle transpired here. And he operated that place for most of his life, right up on Chambersburg Street, which is Main Street in Gettysburg today. He owned a house in later years on High Street, which isn't actually too far up the hill there. It's called High Street for a reason. It's on a hill. What a shocker. And, well, in 1900, yes, you heard that right, he lived till 1900, a news correspondent paid a visit to his home because he was considered a centenarian, that he had lived at least 100 years old. And that is where he tells his legendary exploits, and that's where he also claims he was born in 1790. So according to Robinson, he lived through 3 centuries, born in the 18th century, lived through the entire 19th century, and lived until 1900. And he claimed that the secret to longevity for a long lifespan, going outdoors a lot. Reportedly, he and a friend walked by foot from Gettysburg all the way to Pittsburgh and back. And yes, he was also noted as a heavy tobacco user. Now, unfortunately, not long after that interview, he did pass away in 1900 and is interred here at Lincoln Cemetery. Zoom in on this grave. This is for Herbert A. Matthews, born June 1882, lived till February of 1917. And it looks like we have a veteran of the Spanish-American War, because I see the Cuba on the cross there. Not too used to seeing Spanish-American War placards. As much as I talk about them on the channel, you don't normally see graves around, or you don't see them well marked like a Civil War or World War grave. Here we find the burial for the Watts family, one of the cemetery's most prominent rows. Brothers John and Lloyd were born in Maryland and moved to the area with their parents in the mid-1840s. The battle that quickly made their neighborhood famous likely compelled John to action, for he enlisted with the 8th USCT that mustered into service just 2 months after the engagement. Not much is recorded of his service, save for being wounded at the Battle of Olustee in February 1864. Lloyd, however, has a more storied legacy. He enlisted into the Union Army in 1865, reaching the rank of sergeant with the 24th USCT. Following the war, he became one of Gettysburg's most revered civic leaders. He was a noteworthy teacher and member of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, located just a block from where his mortal remains now lie. Well, that is going to conclude this stop of Retracing History here at Lincoln Cemetery, originally known as the Goodwill Cemetery. Now, if you want to see more videos like this, be sure to subscribe to Readout Productions. Hit the like button to let the algorithm know that you like seeing historical content. Yes, you do want to use YouTube and Rumble to be edumacated. And I'm also going to put a link in for the Preservation Association that maintains this site. If you'd be interested in providing donations to keep the maintenance of these headstones and eventually help them provide for new headstones for unmarked graves, there will be a link to the Lincoln Cemetery Preservation Association. For the record, we're not associated with them in any way. I just want to give them a shout out because this is a part of Gettysburg history, part of Pennsylvania history, part of American history that tends to get overlooked. And I am all for unknown parts of our history finally getting a spotlight. Thank you for watching. We will see you in the next video.